This is Audible.
People of the Lie, The Hope for Healing Human Evil by M. Scott Peck, the author of The Road Less Traveled. Book 2, The Encounter with Evil in Everyday Life. Dr. Peck.
Psychiatrists brush against evil not once or twice in a lifetime, but almost routinely as we come in contact with human crises. And it is my contention that the name of evil should have a definite place in our lexicon. It is true that there are very real dangers to such naming, but without the name, we will never clearly know what we are doing in such cases. We will remain limited in our capacity to help the victims of evil, and we will have no hope whatsoever of dealing with the evil ones themselves. For how can we heal that which we do not even dare study? Since I met the men and women and families I am describing in my practice of psychiatry, I am concerned that the listener will think, "Ah, yes, but these are special cases. These people may be evil, but he is not talking about my kind of people, my colleagues, my acquaintances, my friends or relatives." This is not so. Like it or not, the psychiatrist sees as much psychopathology at cocktail parties, conferences, and corporations as in her or his own office. While the data I am presenting are drawn from my psychiatric practice, most of the time I shall be speaking not so much about psychiatric patients as about human beings anywhere and everywhere. In Book 1, we considered a person, the case of George, who was not evil but was in grave danger of becoming so. Then, to illustrate some of the principles involved in people who had crossed the line and descended into evil, a couple was described, the case of Bobby and his parents. In Book 2, I shall describe others who are frankly evil. The most typical victim of evil is a child. This is to be expected because children are not only the weakest and most vulnerable members of our society, but also because parents wield a power over the lives of their children that is essentially absolute. This power, like all power, is subject to abuse of various degrees of malignancy. A rather intriguing feature of the case of Bobby was the extraordinary unity of his parents. They functioned as a team. We cannot say that Bobby's father was evil, but his mother was not, or that his mother was evil and his father was just along for the ride. As far as I could tell, they were both evil. The victims of evil encountered in everyday psychiatric practice are not, however, always children. Let us turn now to the case of Hartley and Sarah, a childless couple in their late 40s. I shall describe a single interview that I had with the two of them together. It will give us a clue to the further understanding of the phenomenon of evil people. The case of Hartley and Sarah. I first saw them a week after Hartley had been discharged from the state hospital. A month before, at 11 o'clock on a Saturday morning, Hartley had cut both sides of his neck with a straight-edge razor. Bare-chested, he walked into the living room and announced to Sarah, "I just tried to kill myself again." Sarah turned around to see the blood streaming down his torso. She called the police, who called the ambulance. Hartley was taken to the local emergency room. The cuts were relatively superficial. He had failed to sever either the carotid arteries or the jugular veins. After the cuts were sutured, he was transferred to the state hospital. It was his third suicide attempt and third admission to the state hospital during the preceding 5 years. Because they had recently moved into the area, Hartley was referred for follow-up care to our clinic after he was discharged from the hospital. His discharge diagnosis was involutional depressive reaction. He was on high doses of antidepressant and tranquilizing medication. When I went out to the waiting room to greet him, Hartley was sitting silently next to his wife, staring into space with dull eyes. an average-sized gray man who seemed smaller, as if he had been crushed into a very little space. He looked as depressed as the black hole of Calcutta. "I'm Dr. Peck," I said to him. "Come on into my office." "Can my wife come too?" Hartley mumbled in a pleading tone. I looked at Sarah, a thin, angular woman, smaller than her husband, yet seeming considerably larger. "If it's all right with you, Doctor," she responded, smiling sweetly. Her smile was incongruous with the faintly bitter expression conveyed by the tight wrinkles around her mouth. Once we were all seated, I looked at Hartley. "Why did you want your wife to come in with you?" I asked. "I'm more comfortable when she's close to me," he replied flatly. I must have looked quizzical. "Hartley's been that way for the longest time, Doctor," Sarah announced, smiling gaily. "He hates to let me out of his sight for a moment." "Why is that?" I asked Hartley. "I'm scared." "Scared of what?" I inquired. "I don't know. I'm just scared." "I think it's because of his thoughts, Doctor," Sarah interrupted. "Go on, Hartley. You can tell him about your thoughts." Hartley said nothing. "What thoughts is she talking about?" I asked. "My thoughts about kill," Hartley replied in his monotone. "Kill?" I repeated. "You mean you have thoughts about killing?" "No, just kill." "I'm afraid I don't understand," I said lamely. "It's just a word thought," Hartley explained without emotion. "The word kill comes into my mind, like someone had said it. Most of the time it's in the morning, when I get up and start shaving, and start looking at myself in the mirror. It's just there. Kill. Almost every morning." "Do you shave with a straight-edge razor?" I asked with sudden intuition. Hartley nodded. "It sounds as if you want to kill someone with your razor," I continued. Hartley looked frightened. It was the first sign of emotion I had seen. "No," he said emphatically. "I don't want to kill anyone. It's not a feeling. Just a word." "Well, you apparently wanted to kill yourself," I commented. "Why was that?" "I feel so horrible. I'm no good to anyone. I'm nothing but a burden to Sarah." The heaviness of his voice weighed on me. "Is he a burden to you?" I asked Sarah. "Oh, I don't mind," she replied cheerfully. "I would like to be able to have a little time to myself. And of course we don't have enough money." "So he is a burden, you feel?" "The Lord supports me," Sarah answered. "Why is it you don't have enough money?" I asked. "Hartley hasn't worked for 8 years, the poor dear. But we get by on what I make at the telephone company." "I used to be a salesman," Hartley interjected plaintively. "He did manage to work the first 10 years we were married," Sarah agreed. "But he was never really very aggressive, were you, dear?" Hartley was silent. "Why did you stop working?" I asked him. "My depression. I felt so awful in the mornings." "What was making you so depressed?" Hartley looked puzzled, as if unable to remember something. "It must have been my words," he said finally. "You mean the words in your mind like kill?" He nodded. "Are there other words as well?" I asked. Hartley was silent. "Go on, dear," Sarah said. "Tell the doctor about the other words." "Well, sometimes there are other words," he acknowledged reluctantly, "like cut or hammer." "Any others?" "Sometimes blood." "Those are all angry words," I commented. "I don't think they would come into your head unless you were very angry." "I'm not angry," Hartley insisted dully. "What do you think?" I asked, turning to Sarah. "Do you think he's angry?" "Oh, I think Hartley hates me," she answered with her gay little smile. I stared at her in amazement. I had begun to suspect the truth of this, but I hardly expected her to be so calmly aware of it. "Aren't you worried that he might hurt you?" "Oh, no. Hartley wouldn't hurt a fly, would you, dear?" Hartley did not respond. "It seems to me that if I were you, Sarah, I'd be quite frightened, living with a husband who hates you and thinks of such things." "But you don't understand, Doctor," Sarah explained placidly. He couldn't hurt me. He's such a weakling. I quickly glanced at Hartley. There was absolutely no expression on his face. How does it make you feel to hear your wife call you a weakling? She's right. I am weak, he mumbled. Hartley can't even drive a car, Sarah interjected. He can't go out of the house without me, can you, dear? Hartley nodded in dumb assent. You seem to agree with your wife about everything, I pointed out. She's right. I can't go anywhere without her. Why can't you? I don't know, he replied abjectly. I get scared when Sarah isn't around to help me. You sound like you're a very young child, I commented. Sarah smiled complacently. Hartley is a child in some ways, she said. You aren't very grown up, are you, dear? Maybe you don't want him to grow up, I said quickly, turning on her. Sarah flashed me a look of sudden hatred. What? She snapped. When have my wants ever been considered? My wants have never mattered to anyone. It isn't a question of what I want or don't want. I only do what I have to, what the Lord wants me to do. Who cares that Hartley's a burden? Who cares that I do all the work, that I do all the driving, that I do all the shopping? But I don't complain. No, what right do I have? No, Sarah doesn't have any rights. Hartley's just a worm of a man, but no one cares about Sarah. I just shoulder the burdens the Lord has given me. I was taken aback by this diatribe, but I proceeded more out of curiosity than a sense I could help the situation. I gather the two of you have no children, I said. Was that a choice you made? Hartley's incapable of producing children, Sarah announced. Oh? How do you know that? Sarah gave me a look suggesting I was ignorant of the facts of life. Because I've been examined by the gynecologist. He said there's nothing wrong with me. Have you also been examined? I asked Hartley. He shook his head. Why not? Why should I? There's nothing wrong with Sarah, so it must be my fault. Hartley, you're just about the most passive man I've ever met, I said. You passively assume your wife is telling the truth about her examination. You passively assume that because her examination was normal, yours would be abnormal. There are lots of cases in which both the husband and wife are normal but still don't have children. You may well be perfectly okay. Why don't you check it out? There would be no point to that, doctor, Sarah answered for him. We're too old to have children, and we don't have the money for any more tests. You forget that I'm the one who makes all the money. Besides, she said, smiling, can you imagine Hartley being a father? He can't even make a living. But wouldn't it be worth it for Hartley just to know that he's not physically incapable of being a father? Sarah's right, Hartley said, actually coming to the defense of his wife's assumption of his inadequacy. There'd be no point to it. By now I was feeling there was no possibility of help for Hartley. He was too far gone. But how in the name of God did such misery come about, I wondered. Tell me about your childhood, I directed him. There's nothing to tell, Hartley mumbled. Well, how far did you go in school, I asked. Hartley went to Yale, Sarah answered for him again. But then you flunked out, didn't you, dear? Hartley nodded. How did you happen to go to Yale, I asked. My family was wealthy. But you also must have been quite bright, I commented. It's no good being bright if you don't work, Sarah interjected once more. Handsome is as handsome does, I always say. I turned to her. Are you aware that every single time I try to focus on whatever assets your husband might have, you jump in and castrate him? She screeched at me. Castrate him? Castrate him, do I? All you doctors are alike. Maybe you castrate him, they say. It's all my fault, isn't it? Oh, yes, it's always Sarah's fault. Well, let me tell you, he was castrated before I ever met him. His mother was an alcoholic slob. His father was as weak as he is. He couldn't even make it through college. And then they accused me of marrying him for his money. Ha! What money? His slut of a mother had spent all the money slopping up her booze. I haven't seen any money. Nobody's ever helped me out. Sarah does it all. But she castrates him, they accuse. But do you think any of them are ever interested in me? No, no one. They just accuse me. I could be interested in you, Sarah, I said gently, adding, if you'd let me. Why don't you tell me something about your family and your growing up? "Oh, so now I'm the patient, am I?" she asked bitterly. "Well, I'm sorry. I'm not going to be your guinea pig. I don't need your help. There's nothing wrong with me. I can get all the help I need from my minister. He understands me. He knows what I go through. God gives me all the strength I require. I brought Hartley here for help. He's the one who needs it. You help him. That is, if you can." "I'm quite serious, Sarah," I said. "You're quite right that Hartley needs help, and we will give him whatever help we can. But I think you need help as well. It's a terribly difficult situation that you're in, and I can see you get upset by it." But Sarah had pulled herself together. She smiled at me as if I was a nice but misguided young man. "Thank you, Doctor, you're very kind," she said, "but I'm afraid I don't get upset." "I beg to differ," I countered. "I think you just were upset. Quite upset." "Perhaps you're right, Doctor," Sarah replied. "Hartley's illness has been a terrible burden on me. It would be much easier for me if he didn't exist." I winced inwardly. Hartley was so depressed and downtrodden that he was beyond being affected. "Why don't you leave him then?" I asked. "I think you would be better off without the burden, and in the long run it might also be better for Hartley if he were forced to stand on his own 2 feet. "Oh, I'm afraid Hartley needs me too much for that, Doctor," Sarah responded, smiling maternally. She turned to her husband. "You wouldn't be able to make it if I left you, would you, dear?" Hartley looked terrified. "It would certainly be very difficult for him," I acknowledged. "But it could perhaps be arranged for Hartley to go into the hospital for an extended period of time." "Would you like to go back to the hospital, dear?" Sarah asked him. "And have me leave you?" "Please," Hartley whined. "Please don't. Tell the doctor why you don't want me to leave, will you, dear?" Sarah commanded. "I love you," Hartley whimpered. "See, Doctor," Sarah explained victoriously. "I couldn't leave him when he loves me." "But do you love him?" I asked. "Love?" Sarah asked, almost with amusement. "What is there to love?" "No, I think you might best call it duty, Doctor. I have a duty to take care of him." "I'm not sure how much it's duty and how much it's need," I said, confronting her. "From where I sit, it looks as if you have a deep-seated need for the burden that Hartley represents, just as he has an overpowering need to depend on you. Your needs are being fulfilled by this strange marriage just as much as his are." Sarah laughed oddly, a weird, hollow giggle. "Apples and oranges, Doctor," she said. "You can't compare them. You can't compare Hartley and me. We're like apples and oranges. But you don't know which is which, do you? Am I the apple or am I the orange? Am I crinkly-skinned or smooth-skinned? Or am I thick-skinned? We have to be thick-skinned against those who persecute us. You're the pseudoscience persecutors. But it's all right. I know how to handle the orange peelers and the apple slicers. The Lord loves me. We have power in heaven. You can think what you think, say what you say, but it's garbage," she spat. "That's where they end up, isn't it? The orange peels and the apple slices, in the garbage. And that's where all you pseudoscience persecutors will end up, in the garbage, with all the other fruits," she ended triumphantly. I became frightened that I had made a mistake in confronting Sarah as I listened to her lose her control. "I gather you don't feel yourself in need of any treatment at this time, Sarah, and certainly you seem to be functioning well. But Hartley definitely seems to require some assistance, don't you think?" "Yes, poor Hartley is not doing well," Sarah agreed, acting as if the past few minutes had never happened. "We should do whatever we can to help him." "Do you think you need to stay on your medicine?" I asked Hartley. He nodded mutely. "Your thoughts get worse when you don't take your pills, don't they, dear?" Sarah said. He nodded again. "How about psychotherapy, Hartley?" I asked. "Do you think you'd like to spend some time with someone talking about yourself in depth?" "No, it makes me feel bad," he mumbled. "His last suicide attempt before this one occurred when they tried to give him psychotherapy," Sarah confirmed. I wrote out Hartley's prescriptions and said I would like to see them again in 3 weeks to determine whether the medication needed adjusting. "But that appointment," I explained, "will be very brief." "Of course, Doctor," Sarah said as the 3 of us stood up. You've already done so much for Hartley, we can't thank you enough." As Hartley and Sarah were going out the door, I overheard Sarah say, "This doctor's so much nicer than the one at the other clinic, don't you think? At least he's American. We couldn't even understand what that other one was saying, could we, dear?" Perhaps the most interesting aspect of this case is not Sarah's evil, but Hartley's relationship to it. Hartley was in thrall to Sarah. He had voluntarily sold his soul into Sarah's keeping. Why? At one point during the session, I had told Hartley that he was just about the most passive man I'd ever met. A passive person means an inactive person, a follower instead of a leader, a receiver instead of a doer. I could have used a number of other words: dependent, infantile, lazy. Hartley was monumentally lazy. His relationship with Sarah was that of an infant clinging to its mother. He would not even come into my office alone, much less take the risk or exert the energy to think independently for himself. Why Hartley was so extremely lazy, we do not know for certain. Sarah's comments that his mother was an alcoholic and his father as weak as he suggest that he came from a family in which his parents probably served as lazy role models, and he probably failed to receive adequate fulfillment of his infantile needs. We can postulate that by the time he met Sarah, he was already a profoundly lazy person, a child in adult's clothing who was unconsciously seeking the strong mother he never had to take care of him. Sarah filled the bill perfectly, just as he undoubtedly met her requirements for a potential slave. Once the relationship was established, it became a vicious circle, naturally intensifying the sickness of each. Her domination further encouraged his submissiveness, and his weakness further nourished her desire for power over someone. So Hartley was not simply an unwilling victim of Sarah's evil. This is important, because the case exemplifies a general rule. We do not become partners to evil by accident. As adults, we are not forced by fate to become trapped by an evil power. We set the trap ourselves. The case of Hartley and Sarah was introduced, in part, by the observation that it seemed impossible to tell which partner of an evil couple was the evil one. Both of Bobby's parents seemed evil, but by the very nature of their evil, I was unable to get close enough to them to know them well. My purely speculative suspicion is that they were not as equally evil as they seemed. I doubt it is possible for two utterly evil people to live together in close quarters of a sustained marriage. They would be too destructive for the necessary cooperation. I suspect, therefore, that one or the other of Bobby's parents was the more dominant in their mutual evil. In every evil couple, if we could examine them closely enough, I imagine we would find one partner at least slightly in thrall to the other, in the same manner as Hartley was in thrall to Sarah, albeit hardly to the same degree. If the listener feels Hartley and Sarah's relationship was a bizarre one, I agree. Bizarre though it was, the type of relationship it illustrates is quite common. The phenomenon of thraldom in marriage is not rare. I suspect that listeners will, on reflection, also be able to recognize this type of marriage among at least some of their acquaintances. In Book 1, I defined evil as the use of power to destroy the spiritual growth of others for the purpose of defending and preserving the integrity of our own sick selves. In short, it is scapegoating. We scapegoat not the strong, but the weak. For the evil to so misuse their power, they must have the power to use in the first place. They must have some kind of dominion over their victims. The most common relationship of dominion is that of parent over child. Children are weak, defenseless, and trapped in relation to their parents. They are born in thrall to their parents. It is no wonder, then, that the majority of the victims of evil, such as Bobby, are children. They are simply not free or powerful enough to escape. For adults to be the victims of evil, they too must be powerless to escape. They may be powerless when a gun is held to their head, or they may be powerless by virtue of their own failure of courage. Hartley was physically free to escape. Theoretically, he could have just walked away from Sarah, but he had bound himself to her by chains of laziness and dependency, and though titularly an adult, he had settled for the child's impotence. Whenever adults, not at gunpoint, become victims of evil, it is because they have, one way or another, made Hartley's bargain. To name something correctly gives us a certain amount of power over it.